I think specifically your take on systemic racism, that was something that was kind of interesting to me. Um, I couldn't understand that one.
Did you read that Wall Street Journal article I cited with all the studies?
No, I did not. Can you want to link it, or can you just give me the rundown of what it basically is?
Yeah, sure. There's a Wall Street Journal article, opinion piece published, I guess, a couple weeks ago. It's the number one most read story on Wall Street Journal right now. It cites four or five different studies and data pieces. Let's see if I still have it saved here. I think I might have it saved here. Yeah, it's called the myth. It's called the myth of systemic police racism. And so what it talks about different data, and then it talks about a series of studies undercutting the claim of systemic police bias in August 2019 in the proceedings of the National Academy of the Sciences. And then there's no significant evidence of anti-black disparity in the likelihood of being fatally shot by the police. So that was that August 2019 study in the National Academy of the Sciences, and then a 2015 Justice Department analysis found that white police officers were less likely than black or Hispanic officers to shoot unarmed black suspects. And then there has been research by Harvard economist Roland Fryer, found no evidence of racial discrimination in shootings. And then typically what you see in a lot of the other studies and other evidence and other data points that people point out, they always fail to take into account crime rates and civilian behavior before and during interactions with police. So if you look at some like raw data and you don't take into account crime rates and differences in crime rates, then you can certainly have data that points to systemic police racism. But that study, and then I guess that's like three. Oh, and then there's other actual. Well, I guess there's three main studies: Justice Department study, Harvard economist Roland Fryer study, and then a study in the National Academy of the Sciences. And then this author herself has done kind of a bunch of other studies on it too.
Okay, but I feel like then I think we're already at a bit of a stasis here. Can you define to me what exactly is systemic oppression and systemic racism to you? Because that
Uh,
article seemed not to address any of the points that I would use to define one small myopic point, tangential point that would have to do with what systemic oppression and systemic racism is.
which is what?
Just specifically police shooting black men. that's that's
No,
that's not
this article directly addressed that. There's
yeah, but
actually no.
that's not but I'm saying that's not what systemic oppression is.
Oh, okay. I mean, I would define systemic oppression of either laws or policies or regulations that, or actual de facto sort of enforcement of laws and policies that actually differentiate based on race is what I would
Sure, but
define
then
it as.
that would just be one system, right? Like then you obviously have the education system disproportionately and negatively impacts African Americans. The criminal justice system clearly, when it comes to sentencing, disproportionately sentences blacks. So there's like so many different layers to it. And then, of course, obviously, some of the effects felt now have to do with redlining, which was definitely something that systemically negatively impacted blacks. As recent as 2009, we obviously had a lawsuit because of the fact that there were unfairly and disproportionately putting interest rates on black home loans, regardless of credit score and income. So I don't. I would think that there's like a whole bunch of different things that would end up kind of speaking to this systemic oppression that people are constantly talking about. That wouldn't specifically just be police shooting, which it seems like your article was mostly talking about.
Sure. So I mean, my response to a lot of that is that I don't think that it's people's race that is defining all of those statistics. See somebody, and when I see somebody doing something or meet somebody, I don't immediately define them by their race, ask them what their race is, and then categorize them by their race and start defining them by race. Most of what happens in the world is made by people making individual decisions, and so you can cite a statistic about a racial statistic about something, and that can be explained by the statistics related to their family situation, statistics related to their economic situation, and a lot of times, it's like, look, a black person in the United States with a stable family, an intact family, a mom and a dad in the same home is going to be in a much, much, much better position than a white person growing up in a broken home with a single mom. And you could say the same thing about economic situations and everything else. Like, I'm not denying that racism exists, and your point about redlining, of course that happened. My point is that the United States has made that illegal under the law, and that when that stuff happens, people get sued for it, and you get in big, big trouble, and you have massive money judgment entered against you. And if that's happening out there, that's illegal, and those businesses need to be sued and held to account. And we absolutely have equality before the law. And to the extent that racism exists, and I know that it does, and I know that there are racist people out there, to the extent that it happens and it goes on, it's illegal, and those people are held to account. For example,
Sure,
with the recent.
hold on really quickly. I feel like because what you're doing again, I think you're focusing on the individuals, right? And I think if we talk about individuals and whether or not individuals can be racist, like that's not what systemic racism is, right? And I think so when we start talking about systemic racism and we start talking about things like when we do large sweeping data of the criminal justice sentencing, and we find if we control specifically for race that there are great disparities. In fact, the Congress did an entire Sentencing Reform Act back in 1968, specifically with the intent of addressing some of these great disparities. And even after putting in these minimum sentences to try to address these great disparities, what we found was that there was just a massive increase in sentencing that disproportionately affected blacks. So then it even still, even though they created this disparity, this change in law to prevent this disparity, it actually just engrossed it and made it larger. So then I feel like in those kind of cases, I wouldn't like me. I personally I'm not accusing you of being racist. So then, like the anecdotal story of like what you would do, of how you judge people, that's not at all speaking to the issue. And I don't think it speaks to the issue if we were to look at any individuals when we talk about systemic racism, because obviously when you talk about individuals, it really speaks more about the fact that racism exists, which I think obviously everyone agrees there are just racist people, not everywhere, not it's not as ubiquitous as it used to be, or pervasive as it used to be, but it still does exist. The idea is when we start talking about systemic oppression, this is when it starts coming into play about things that are outside of individual control and individual direct influence that negatively and disproportionately affect people of color, specifically blacks in this specific situation, or that's the topic of conversation. And if we look at those things, then there's systemically issues that are an issue, and anecdotes can't really belie that in any way.
Well, okay, so using your specific example of sentencing, that is absolutely 100% a result of a specific individual decision, because every single crime that's committed and every single crime that's prosecuted in court ends up with the judge issuing a sentence, and a judge looks at 20 different factors to decide a sentence. And so I haven't looked at the sentencing data. If I mean, I'm certainly there was probably a lot of it in the 60s, and we've done all these different changes.
Oh, it's
And
gotten worse.
the point is, though, is that actual racism by judges in their sentencing is illegal, and if that happens, those people can be kicked off the bench, and they can lose their job as judges, and they're no longer judges. But
Sure, but that's not you. But you can't guarantee. That's not something that you can guarantee to see. So, like, even if a judge is racist, right, in his sentencing practices, it's almost impossible to try to guarantee to try to demonstrate that it's exclusively for race. He could easily point to or hand wave that claim with a whole bunch of other, oh well, no, it was more about, I just felt like this one was more heinous, or I felt like, it was familial to whatever excuses they have. It's almost impossible because judges happen to prevail over a whole like wide array of sentences. So then in order to so then to take to be able to point the finger at an individual judge and say you're being racist, it's really, really incredibly difficult to do. But we're not talking about an individual, because again, an individual will just point to a racist judge. What we're talking about is if we take all data from all judges, all that have existed in an entire span of time, and we see a crazy disparity between sentencing, at that point, then we would be able to say that this criminal justice system, right? Because obviously you wouldn't argue that it's not a system. It's like part of a system of what criminal justice is. This criminal justice system is disproportionately negatively impacting blacks. And in that way, then we would be able to say that would be systemic injustice.
Okay, you're proving my point though, because by you saying that every judge could simply point to differences in each sentence that they give to justify it, and you could never prove that it was racist. That's proving my point that the data that you're relying on could be the result of individual characteristics of sentencing. And so let's say you have a white guy that commits a murder, and then you have a black guy that commits a murder, and then the white guy gets 10 years and the black guy gets 15 years, and all you know is that, oh, they committed a murder. Well, there's about 20 different factors that may have gone into the difference of those sentencing. And so it could have been the heinousness of the crime. It could have been, whether a weapon was used. It could have been whether the victim was elderly or disabled. I mean, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And so for you to cite data that is really a result of individual choices by judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys and everything else is proving my point that
No.
it could just as that could just as easily be explained by the differences in the individual cases that make up that data. Furthermore, I don't think it's a productive way to analyze this as to group people by their race. If you think there's problems with sentencing, then let's figure out what's the problem with sentencing and how to fix it. But by taking data that's a result of a bunch of individual decisions and then saying that this shows that there's systemic racism, what good does that do us? What policy are you proposing?
It does a lot. It does a lot. See, okay, because before
Okay,
you
how do
can
you fix
actually,
it?
sure, let me explain. So before you can fix a problem, most of the time you probably need to figure out exactly what the problem is, right? So in other words, like for example, in this case, what they did was when they made the 1968 Sentencing Reform Act, it didn't take into consideration some of the negative impacts that were they didn't take into consideration what exactly was causing the disparity, right? And so what they did was they just made it worse. And so that's one thing. And then number two, like, yeah, that's what data is. So when we do polling data, like you can't say this is what America believes, right? It's very difficult to say that because there's obviously going to be disparities in differing opinions. So what you do is you start polling people, you get enough of the population to answer specific questions, and then you start being able to determine this tends to be what a pervasive opinion is, right? This is what people believe. So in the same sense, when you're looking to collect data, you're not going to be able to or yeah, so when you're collecting data, yeah, there's going to be plenty of individuals, right? When we can say America as a country has shifted left politically, like over the last 40 years, right? Like, and it's just like, okay, that's happened. So, but then I can point to you to some individuals in red states who are particularly Republican who might have even shifted even more to the right. Now, that doesn't like change the data that America as a country has shifted left, even though these are all individual opinions. And there might be varying reasons for it. But what we have at the end of the day is the fact that America has shifted left over X amount of years. In the same way, sure, there might be plenty of different factors that could be contributing to it. But if we can control for specific factors and we can't come to these conclusions, right? Like if you want to point to like something subjective, like courtroom demeanor, then at that point it's like, okay, well, yeah, well, there's no way to prove that. It literally can't be proven because it's entirely subjective. right? And then I don't even know if you would have any access to any data that would suggest that. However, what we do have access to is something really, really, really simple. I mean, we have something such as race, which we can easily control for, and then determine the length of sentences for others versus, and then you run into a problem. Or so, for example, a perfect example of this, right, is when you look at something like crack cocaine usage, right? And when you have blacks making up 33% of all crack cocaine usage, and then you find out that they're like 80% of all charges and sentencing, and it's like there's a crazy disparity there. Or when you look at the sentences, the exonerations even of people who are found to have been not guilty, and you find that blacks who happen to be exonerated have served many, many more years than the whites who have been exonerated. It takes longer to exonerate a black person than a white person. In these kind of ways, like that's another form of the system that's meant to undo some of the injustices caused by maybe people slipping through the cracks, yet it disproportionately negatively impacts blacks. So I again I think
That's
yeah.
not addressing. That's not addressing my point, though. So let's set aside the debate about the studies and the data and whether the data actually says what you're saying it says, or how this was done, or whether it's a result of a single racist judge here or there. Set aside all of that. What policies are you proposing, and what good does it do to attack the entire system? One of the greatest criminal justice systems in the entire world, one of the greatest justice systems that has done more to promote equality amongst the races than anywhere in the world, a justice system that literally by law requires there to be no racial discrimination, a justice system where if racial discrimination is used, people lose their jobs, judges are removed from the bench if you can show that this happened. What good does it do to attack that wonderful system that we have as systemically racist, using very questionable data, and what good does that do you in terms of actually making proposing a policy that would actually be any good?
Wait a minute, hold on. See, this is kind of interesting because I mean, like, the question you just asked is so weighted, and it already presumes like a whole bunch of things that are already contested. One, you called the data questionable. One, you called it the
I said,
greatest.
setting aside that, what policies are you
Wait,
proposing
hold
where it's
on.
beneficial to attack the entire system?
Hold on.
You
Wait,
haven't
hold
proposed
on.
a policy.
Wait, before we get to the point of that, wait just a second. You're already telling me that I'm questioning the greatest system. If I'm telling you the data shows that this system is incredibly disproportionately negatively affecting black people, then I don't know if it's that great already. Like that's already number one.
That's
Number
fine. That's
two,
why I said set
hold on,
aside all of that. What's your
wait.
policy proposal?
Oh, okay. So I think one of the biggest issues that probably what we need to do is we got to figure out what's leading to some of these cases would probably be most likely the unfair and undisproportionate policing, right? So then we would probably need to figure out and make sure that blacks are not being policed more than whites, and that whites are likely to be charged for crime as often as blacks are, especially when they make up a bigger portion of the crime. And so that's I think one of the issues right there. I think that needs to be done. So I mean,
So you
obviously, we're
tell
already. I mean,
so you implement a policy that says police, you're not allowed to go arrest black people. Like, what are you proposing?
no, that's not what I said. Did you hear me say that?
You said we need to make sure that policing isn't going towards black people as much.
No, I'm sorry. It needs to be proportionate.
Exactly. And how do you implement that? You tell cops they can't go police black people? I'm
Well,
asking for
we
specific.
already
How do you do it?
we already have systems in place. Hold on. So listen, I just want you to understand really quick. This is an insane pivot right here because the conversation that we were having right now, that we were coming into the conversation about, was specifically about whether or not systemic oppression is real. Now we've gotten past that. You've already precluded that systemic oppression is real, and you want to discuss what policies we should change. Before we even get to that point, we need to be able to understand that systemic oppression is real, which is what I came prepared to exemplify.
Okay, well, we can continue to debate whether it's real or not, and I'll continue to say it's not. I guess I was just interested
That's why I
in.
wanted the
I was
data.
just interested. Why? What's the point of this? I think it's counterproductive. I think it's not helpful. I think it does more harm than good. And so, if all you want to debate is whether it exists or not, and you're not prepared to actually talk about what the good is of even making the claim that you're making, that's fine. But I just don't think that's a very productive way to go about discussing topics and issues.
It's extremely productive, and here's why. So we have this problem right now where what we need, we're probably going to obviously need policy reform, right? We're going to need people to be, we're going to need people to rally behind the cause of rectifying some of the systemic oppression and some of the systemic racism that blacks face on a regular basis, people of color in general and minorities face on a regular basis. So in order for us to do that, I think the very first thing is to identify, like, I mean, this is like really basic. Everyone knows the first step to correcting a problem is being able to identify and admit that you have a problem. So I think in this specific case, it absolutely is incredibly productive, because when if you start saying, say for example, I have this policy idea of, let's make sure less police are harshly targeting blacks, that already assumes that you believe that police are harshly and unfairly and improperly targeting blacks. Now, if you don't agree with that, then my policy idea in that point sounds like complete. It sounds like rubbish. It's like, wait, what do you mean? Like, why that's not even happening in the first place? Why would we make that? Right. So then at that point, before we can even get there, we first need to establish, this is why this is particularly effective, why this is particularly important, the single most important portion of the conversation at this stage right now, because it's obviously a very divisive tactic. I mean, a divisive topic. And so it's like, no, we need to do everything we can to inform people about what exactly is happening, what the data actually shows. So then when we start talking about policy changes, then it starts making sense, because obviously going to someone with the policy idea that you have in mind, when they don't even believe that the issue that you're representing is real, it's going to sound ridiculous. It's the same way how, like, when you approach Republicans about like climate change thing, you're like, we should implement this rule to fix climate change, and they're looking at you like, wait, what the heck are you talking about? I don't even think that's real. So why would I create some sort of barrier or some sort of inconvenience based on this imaginary problem? Like, no, I don't want to do that at all. You're going to get zero support from those people unless you can eliminate all inconvenience. And it's like, well, I don't care, right? So yeah, this is incredibly important, because once you can identify the issue, then yeah, now you have something that you can actually work with. And once people, then you can galvanize people for support when you do want to start talking about policy reform, right? Wouldn't that make the most sense?
Well, I mean, I guess theoretically, if your entire purpose is to try to convince people of your specific policy, but if you're interested in having an actual debate on policy grounds and data grounds, I'm perfectly capable of saying, look, let's set aside the data because the data is disputed. Let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that your data is correct. Then you can talk about policy, and I totally disagree with you that if I agreed with you that there was all this horrible systemic racism, then I would automatically support what I consider to be a bad policy to fix that problem. Absolutely not. I'm not going to support a policy that defines people by their race and is a bad way of achieving the goals that you want to get to, even if I believed your data. So first of all, I reject the data, but more importantly, even if your data was true, I have better policy ways to resolve it, including a lot of the policies that we've already implemented, including making racism illegal, including prohibiting prosecutors from striking jurors based on race. All of these different policy ideas that we've already implemented are way better than the policies that you've proposed here. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, first, let's have a debate on the facts. There's two different things. There's facts, there's policies. We can debate the facts, and I'm happy to debate the facts all day long, because that's what we can do. Secondly, regardless of the facts, policy has outcomes, and there's principles and values involved with policies. There's good and bad things involved with policies. You could accept my facts and we could debate policy. I could accept your facts and we could debate policy. My point is, the only reason I bring it up is because I never, ever, ever hear anybody that supports the idea of systemic racism in the United States ever come up with any kind of decent policy. And so and so that's why
Sure.
I'm
Okay.
interested
Yeah.
in it.
All right. Good. 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 That's why I hope I explained it, but I'll try to do it really succinctly this time. The reason why you probably never ever hear anyone discussing things like policy when it comes to systemic oppression is because a very significant portion of the population is in complete denial that systemic oppression even exists in the first place. So a talk about policy at that point is really reductive. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? A perfect example of that is like how California like implemented a law where they implemented a thing where a law where it's like, you can't just give people straws, plastic straws. They have to ask for plastic straws, and in restaurants and so on and so forth. And it was like, why? And it's like, well, because we're trying to like limit plastic, and it's like, why? Because it's like negatively impacting the environment. What? What? No, it's not. Then that whole policy sounds absolutely absurd. It sounds absolutely
Okay.
ridiculous.
So
So
you're basically saying that you and your side of this viewpoint have done a terrible job of convincing the American people that there is such a thing as systemic racism in the most wonderful, just society on earth that's done more for the equality of the races than any country in the history of the world. And so you're admitting that you have not met your burden of proving that the United States is this horribly unjust, evil, systemically racist society. And so we're still at the first step where let's just talk about the data. As long as
well,
if
sure.
that's where we're at, is that you admit that nobody believes this, and you're trying
No,
to
no. I'm
push an
sorry.
idea
No.
that you admit nobody believes in, then we can debate this data. If that's where we're starting with the presumption that hardly anybody actually believes in systemic racism, and so
So
we're
that
going to just talk about whether it exists or not, and then maybe later we can talk about policy.
Sure. So
That's
here's what's
fine.
happening. No. So one that's beyond pejorative and it's definitely uncharitable. It's honestly, frankly, dishonest to be real with you. So what happened here is never did I ever say nobody believes it. I just said a significant portion of the policy. We obviously have partisan politics. The belief that systemic racism exists, it's not some like very nuanced point of view, right? Like that's honestly dishonest. I never said anything close to that. Secondly, for you to make the argument that like, oh, so we've just done a terrible job. I don't think that we've done a terrible job. I think most of the time people avoid having conversations on these kind of things, and when they do get into conversations on these kind of things, they do really feckless things like shift the conversation to other points and pivot into other things. Like, well, let's talk about something. Let's ignore the systemic oppression part and talk about this new topic because they don't want to actually confront the idea that the system is racist. And so I'm finding that even in this conversation right now, that I'm running into a problem where it feels like I want to try to get to the bottom of it and prove that this thing exists, so then we can actually have one of those conversations. And I felt like over the last 10 minutes, there's been an incredible amount of resistance and actually delving into the topic, and really more of a desire to pivot to something else, so that you don't ever have to actually confront the actual facts, whether or not systemic racism happens. And I don't believe it only happens with you. I found that these kind of conversations that I engage with people on a regular basis are really replete with these very banal untruths and pejorative manipulation of data in order to maintain this erroneous position. And I find that that's what you're doing and what people like you do on a regular basis. Now, I'm not saying anything. I'm not talking about you as your character. I think it's a human condition to want very much to defend your position and your point of view without actually getting into it, because it feels very awful to admit that you're wrong. And so I find that we're going to have a very big challenge. Furthermore, it's going to be something that belies most people. When you have people who have engaged with the criminal justice system and things have gone copacetic and perfectly fine and amicable, then you're like, okay, hey, these people feel very comfortable and confident in the way that the criminal justice system works. Now, you can't walk a mile through a black man's shoes, or a person of color shoes, because that's just not your lived experience. So when someone comes to you with data or with information about something that completely contradicts your point of view and your personal empirical experiences, at that point you tend to probably buck against it, which is very, very reasonable. It's completely like it's not indicative of any form of racism or anything like that. It's just this is what's reasonable, this is what makes sense, and this is what's happening. This is what's happened in previous conversations I've had. This is what's happening right now in this conversation. This is one of the part of the big problems. And the other issue is most people aren't prepared with data. Most people aren't very well informed. Most people aren't articulate enough to really explain that. I'm sharp enough to recognize when there's a pivot, and I almost went down that rabbit hole of talking about policy reform, and I actually indulged a tiny bit, and then I realized very quickly, wait a minute, now I'm being part of the problem. Most people don't have that wherewithal to be able to stop themselves from doing that. It's all too tempting to start saying, man, yes, goody, I would love to talk about what would be my dream world about how we could reform and rephrase this justice system. That sounds very, very beautiful. But in reality, I recognize now there's a lot of work to do before we even get there. Most people don't have that sort of sense.
Okay, well, don't take it personally.
Sure.
I love debating politics and policy, and nobody ever said at the very beginning of this that we're not allowed to talk about policy. We're only talking about the facts and the data about systemic racism. So if you want to get back to simply debating whether as a factual matter systemic racism exists in the United States, then we can do that. Don't take it personally that I wanted to talk about politics or policy or anything else, because you never said that we're limiting what we can talk about here.
No. It's not about me trying to limit what we can talk about. Like, and it's not a personal thing at all to me that you wanted to shift the conversation to something else and pivot. Like, that's not a personal attack.
It's not pivoting or shifting the conversation. You're talking about a problem that you're alleging. I simply asked, what the heck is your solution? That's not some massive pivot. It's simply that's how conversations on politics go. You debate the facts and then you debate the policy. If you don't want to debate policy, that's fine. We can go back to debate. We can go back to debating, but it's not some pivot or attempt to get out of it. It's simply, okay, we talked for 20 minutes on systemic racism, and I gave you my studies and data, and you gave your studies and data, and I'm like, and then it's like, okay, well, even if what you're saying is true, what's the point? That's all. It's not some huge pivot. It's the next step in the argument. So don't take it personally. Don't take it as, some, big weird attempt to try to change the subject to get you, or this, that, and the other thing. That's just how it goes. And if you really just want to talk about system, let's do it, because we talked about that, and as far as I could tell, we hit there was really nothing more to talk about. I gave you my studies. Whoa. I gave you my data. You said you said that there was a bunch of sentencing data that proves systemic racism. I said sentencing data is the result of individual choices by judges, and there's a bunch of different factors that go into it. And what else is there to debate?
Okay, so so you're first off, so you're basically saying that because individual judges within the criminal justice system make decisions, that we can't come to any conclusory data regarding those decisions?
I think it's very difficult to say that an entire system is racist when the system is made up of thousands of individuals making individual choices based on a bunch of different factors. And look, I'm not I haven't spent hours and hours and hours reading through all of the different studies. I'm not prepared to talk about all the different specific studies. My point is that I know enough about the criminal justice system to know that simply pulling out data about the races of who's been charged with crimes, and then looking at sentencing data is not going to be able to tell you that the entire system is racist, particularly when the entire system is based on a bedrock understanding that all men are created equal, and that if anybody in the system does anything racist, that's immediately the convictions are thrown out and people lose their jobs. I also don't think it's healthy.
For centuries, actually, that hasn't been enforced for centuries. Like when we say all men are created equal, when that was like written, like they still owned slaves. Like there was a 3/5 compromise during that time.
As look, as
The
look,
Civil Rights Act didn't happen until what, like 1963. Come
Martin
on, and
Luther
then
Martin
even after
Luther King
1963, there was
Jr.
still segregation, and then even during the segregation, we saw obviously disparate policing and disparate sentencing even during that time. So the idea that like this is on the bedrock of all men are created equal, you got to understand why something like that, a sentence like that, would have so very little weight to a person of color who has been disproportionately negatively impacted by this country in certain ways, in comparison to their white counterparts. When we have these kind of statements there, you understand why that would be like, that would almost sound like farce or hogwash, right?
No, absolutely not, because I agree with what Martin Luther King Jr. taught. And Martin, if you've never read Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, I would recommend reading it, because Martin Luther King Jr. understood that America made a promise at its founding that all men are created equal. No, it was not perfect, but that's a promise at the bedrock of American society that all men are created equal, and America has come farther and done more for the equality of all races than any other country on earth, and including the fighting a civil war to end slavery, including the civil rights movement, including enacting into law the Civil Rights Act, and including everything else that's been done. And we are now in 2020, where there is not a single thing holding anybody in this country back based on race, other than individual decisions of family members and the individuals themselves. And to the extent that there are racists out there, and there's a racist judge that makes a racist decision and sentence a black person for longer than he sentenced a white person, and he does it based on race, that's horrible. Nobody supports that. That's illegal under the law. And so that's not at all unreasonable to say America's bedrock principle is equality, all men are created equal, and that we've done a very, very, very good job of living up to that promise. And Martin Luther King Jr. specifically talked about it.
Please don't do that. Please don't do that. So that's completely unrealistic, and that's just dishonest, to be honest. Because if you read that speech, you understand that it was a dream. It wasn't something that he had personally experienced. It wasn't something that he personally lived. Also in that speech is his admission that America hadn't kept that promise. Like that was part of that was one of his speeches as well.
Well, he said we need to live up to it.
I totally respect that. So you got to understand, the fact that he's saying that we need to live up to it means that he currently hadn't experienced that they hadn't lived up to it up to that point.
But his point was that America was not founded on all of these horrible things. His point was that America was founded on this notion that we've done a very good job of leading up to. In fact, I'll even quote it for you, because
no. Wait, hold on. Wait a second. The idea that yes, this is our claim, this is what we believed, and clearly his lived experience was so very different, was indicative of the fact that his point was we had not, regardless of what our stated our declaration of what our intentions were, we clearly hadn't lived up to that piece of the bargain, right?
The point is that yes, he was saying that we hadn't lived up to it at that time.
Okay.
But the point, what Martin Luther King Jr. recognized is that, and I quote, "The magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir." And that is very important. That portion of that speech is very important, because it recognizes that the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence contained magnificent words. All men are created equal. And for you here to sit here today and shit on that and say, oh, bullshit, all men are created equal, that falls on deaf ears, blah, blah, blah. That's why I cite Martin Luther King Jr., because you criticized that. You criticized that and said that sounds like, you said hogwash is exactly what you said. And I'm saying that's not hogwash. That's the bedrock of America was founded upon. We're all heirs to that magnificent words.
Well, and don't do that. Please be fair. Be fair for a second. Never did I say the fact that all men are created equal is hogwash. I didn't say that. Please don't misquote and mischaracterize my point. The point that I was
making. What did you say was hogwash then? You said hogwash.
What I said was hogwash was your inherent belief that because that was pinned, that somehow had to have existed inside of the hearts and the minds of the individuals that pinned it, and that they viewed black men they viewed black people as people during that time. That's what I'm saying. It's hogwash.
Many of them did.
I'm sorry. Let me explain. So when you make the statement Well, listen, they clearly treated you guys and believed you guys were equal because they wrote it in the words while they still own slaves. Then that sounds like hogwash. The fact it's not not the words themselves, because obviously I believe that all men are created equal. However, I think what the hogwash is when you start trying to say this must have existed in some of the hearts of the men who literally wrote it while owning slaves. That's what I'm saying is hogwash. Please don't mischaracterize my words that way. That's kind of snaky, man.
Okay, well, that's you're splitting hairs on that. The point is that
No,
you're
I'm making sure that what I said was no. There's a very it's not splitting hairs. There's a very humongous difference between all men are created equal as hogwash, and I don't believe that those people believed that when they wrote it. That those are two very different
well,
things.
that's also false because again, this is what Martin Luther King Jr. recognized is that many of America's founders actually did believe that all men are created equal. They actually did hate slavery. They literally enacted the Constitution with those words in it to set the country on a path to achieving that promise. And that's why I quote that speech and that's why I bring it up. And for so you to denigrate the Constitution and to say that that phrase and do all of this stuff.
No, that's dishonest again. Never did I denigrate the Constitution. I believe we live in the greatest country in the history of the world. I believe that our Constitution is probably the single best piece of literature regarding a country. I think it's literally the single best. I've never ever said anything negative about our Constitution. What I spoke about was the hearts of the individual that penned it, who clearly were hypocrites, or some of the individuals who wrote it were clearly hypocritical because they wrote it while owning slaves. Please, again, do not intentionally, because I feel like you're going down this road where you're intentionally doing this repeatedly now, where you're intentionally misquoting and mischaracterizing my words. I feel like you could be a little bit more charitable than that, because I never ever have ever denigrated our Constitution ever. I believe we live in the single greatest country that has ever existed. But just like all things, regardless of their great, it can be improved. Hold on, I want to quote one more thing, by the way, since you wanted to quote Martin Luther King. Where he talks in his speech, he says, what's it called? In the sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. The next sentence is, this note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on that promissory note. Insofar as her citizens of color are concerned, instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. So if we're going to quote Martin Luther King and you're going to tell me what the point of it was, I obviously his thing here wasn't to denigrate the Constitution or to speak disparagingly about it. What his position was, it was clearly that they hadn't kept up their end of the bargain, and that clearly Negroes at this point had suffered a lot of damage at the hands of these people claiming to be upholding the Constitution. That was the purpose of it. So if we're going to take that little bit of excerpt, I feel like now that we put the context there, I think it's very clear and evident that, there has been some obviously maligning of people of color, and that's exactly the system that we're talking against, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we want to undo.
Here's my point. Here's my point about that. That was true in 1963 when he said it. And in 2020, where we actually have equality before the law, we actually have laws. Laws that make it illegal to engage in racial discrimination. The United States certainly has lived up to that, and certainly has lived up to it a lot more than any other country. And so that is just a fact. And so honestly,
that's not true. Let's look at the numbers. So we have the Minneapolis Police Department, and we find out that black people only make up 18% of the population, right? Like 18% of that population, and whites make up 60% of that population. But then blacks make up 62% of all body searches, and 63% of people whose cars were searched. Like, that
doesn't prove systemic racism. What percentage are the ones that what percentage of people do an activity that results in getting their car searched?
So
You can't just cite
No,
that
okay, no,
and
no, I
then
got you.
not
No, no,
and
I got
not.
you. I got you. Here, let me respond to that. So we've already have there's very large sweeping studies that have proven that blacks are less likely to be carrying contraband in their car, yet they still make up the majority of police searches. Like in the entire state of California, this is the state that I live, so it obviously is a little bit more personal to me. But in the state of California, when they look at all of the police searches and they find that blacks are more likely to be searched, yet less likely to turn up any form of paraphernalia or contraband, I think that's indicative of a problem. That's indicative of a problem. We are over policed. That is part of the issue. That is part of what the systemic oppression is. We have the 1994 crime bill, which absolutely disproportionately affected blacks, for sure. Like, so yes, these are these are forms of systemic oppression. The 2009 lawsuit where they found that they were giving blacks with higher credit scores and higher incomes worse loans. That's predatory. That's a systemic issue. When you have blacks who are unable to own property because of homeowners associations originally being erected specifically to prevent blacks from moving into neighborhood, thus crippling their capital gain, crippling their wealth. Obviously, that's one of the most reliable and consistent forms that Americans participate and in the economy, in gaining wealth. That's how it happens. That's how you create generational wealth in the vast majority of cases. And blacks were systemically kept from that. That was recent. So then, what are you supposed to do now? Obviously, I'm an outlier here, right? I got really great income, literally zero criminal history. Things are going absolutely swimmingly for me. But I also recognize, despite this fact, that I happen to be an outlier. I happen to recognize that that's not the case for most people. Most people struggle with education in black neighborhoods. That's a system. That's a system that's problematic. Education is absolutely based on property values, and the property values in black neighborhoods due to redlining is terrible. So then obviously their education is underfunded, and that goes through generations. Education is the single greatest factor impacting people's income, in fact, impacting people's living. So yeah, obviously that's a systemic problem. That problem hasn't been eradicated. It's not like, okay, hey, now redlining is gone, so now you can just get whatever. Now you can just all of these neighborhoods will suddenly become beacons of growth and expansion. It's like, no, that hasn't happened. We can still see some of those issues in Detroit, and I don't have to go through any specifics. In the majority of cases, we can still see dilapidated neighborhoods remain dilapidated, except for gentrification, in which case most minorities and people of color are relocated elsewhere. So ultimately, to sit there and try to look at every individual system in this country thus far and not see that it had a deleterious effect on African Americans at this point, and then to be able to still make the claim that systemic racism doesn't exist, I feel like you either you're intentionally misinformed or you really haven't just seen any data.
No,
Like,
no. Here's my response to that. You're citing facts that don't support your argument. So I never said that there's no lasting legacy of slavery and segregation that result in differences between the value of a neighborhood in a black community and the value of homes elsewhere, or that there's no lasting. You're citing statistics about differences between home values, for example, or wealth in families. I'm willing to admit that certainly that there are lasting legacies of the injustices that happened in the past. That does not mean that today we have systemic racism. Those are two different things. One is a lasting impact of something that happened a long time ago. The other thing is what is the system now? And in my point is that the system now is not systemically racist because we literally have laws that specifically and explicitly prohibit racism. And those are two different things. We do not have any laws or policies or regulations or government rules of any kind whatsoever that are discriminatory against any race whatsoever. And in fact, we have the exact opposite. The United States has specific laws that say all races are to be treated equal and that you cannot discriminate based on race. There's nothing systemic about our current system that's racist. And you citing some statistics about the differences between racial groups in the United States does nothing to prove that our current system is systemically racist.
Okay, so let's call it good. I'm glad. So you just admitted something there, which I think is kind of like really points to where we're talking about, right? So the thing that you just admitted, you said that the property values obviously has like a lasting effect, and the redlining has had a lasting effect on the property values, different of some of these minority neighborhoods and things like that, right? Like you admitted to that.
Well, I don't know about the property values, but it seems to make sense to me that since we had centuries of slavery and decades of segregation and actual systemic racism. I mean, I would admit that in the past the United States has had systemic racism because we literally had laws that discriminated against black people. That absolutely was. I'm not saying I never said that there's no. I said that there's no. I never said there's no lasting impacts on that. I'm saying our system today is not racist. The redlining was something that was, I believe you admitted that they got in trouble and that was illegal and they got sued and they've been regulated to all hell. And if anybody did that redlining today, they'd be sued to Bolivian. They'd go right out of business. And I never said that there's not a single business out there or a single person that's never engaged in a racist activity. If a bank or an insurance, anybody did something that doesn't show systemic racism at all.
You literally didn't address the question I asked in any way, shape, or form. But let's go back to it. So I was asking you specifically, were you willing to admit that redlining still has an impact on some of the communities that exist today? Would you say that any communities today are affected by the redlining that existed in the past? Would you say would you say that would be true at all?
Sure, maybe. I don't know. But even if it does, it doesn't prove systemic racism.
Okay, so all right, so that's where the problem is because you probably haven't done any researching on that, but it's okay. We'll move past that. So we'll preclude that it does. Okay, we'll just assume that it does. So if it does, and we have a system currently that education is inextricably tied to the property values of communities, then in that case, would it not be fair to say that education is a system? I'm sorry, the funding of education is systemically oppressive to blacks?
No, because nobody is forcing anybody to live in any particular school district. We live in a free country where everybody can move. You can go live somewhere else. You can go to a different school district. Sure. And if there's a difference in property value,
you've already admitted economic differences would lead people to be in specific neighborhoods, right? Like we obviously understand that. We understand that there's a lasting economic impact from some of the effects of the racism which have affected throughout society. So then just to suggest as if people can just up and move to another entirely different location and then just, okay, well, it's all right. I'll go live, in Roland Heights, or I don't know. I'm trying to think of a wealthy neighborhood. I'll go live in Beverly Hills because the education there is better as opposed to the place where they live. It's just not economically tenable for most people, right? So then, especially because there's been like almost no generational wealth, like it's like almost like a 9-to-1 ratio because of the inability to obtain property for quite some time. So yeah, like obviously, but that would be a problem right now, right? Where we would say, because we obviously understand that economically, a lot of these people literally can't afford to go live in a wealthier neighborhood where the education would be better. So then because of the fact that they're pretty much relegated to living in the neighborhoods that they are, that it would make more sense to probably say that this system is something that is inherently going to negatively impact the blacks that are living there.
I disagree, and here's why. There's other factors that play into the property values way more than I guess impacts from redlining. There's other way more important impacts on property value, including what's the crime rate like in that area, and that is then resulting from what's the status of families in that neighborhood. Are they all single parent families? Are they intact families? And so these are you're like all of your examples are examples of data that has a very, very complicated inputs. And so like with sentencing, there's 20, 30, 40, 50 factors that go into sentencing. With property values, there's 100 factors that go into property value, and your first instinct is to blame it on racism when there's a million other explanations for it.
No, there's not a million excellent explanations, because you just mentioned one of them, which obviously falls back on the same issue. You mentioned poverty in an area. I'm sorry. You mentioned that there might be higher crime in an area, but we obviously already know, like, we have all the data to support this, and I'm pretty sure you wouldn't, even Republicans can't disagree with this one, right? Poverty, like, and crime are tied together, right? You understand that, like, where there's higher poverty, then there just tends to be an increase in crime. So when you do things like redlining and things, or preventing people from obtaining wealth and whatnot. And also, there's another factor that's really important.
You're blaming it on something from how long ago? It's not all because of that.
Oh, no. I'm sorry. So redlining was literally...
You're blaming everything on redlining.
I'm sorry. So redlining was literally as recent as 1977, right? That's the date that it was abolished. And even though it's been abolished, God knows how many economists will tell you, even though it's been legally abolished, that it still isn't necessarily enforced, and that we still can recognize the practices being carried out today. That's point number one. And then point number two, when you say something as recent as 1977, bruh, my mom was born, back in the 50s? So, like, she went through that. She experienced that. That was her life. I mean, obviously, she was raised a little bit more upper middle class, so she didn't go through it to the same degree as others, right? But the fact of the matter is, like, there are plenty of people that are alive today that inherited some of the ramifications from the redlining that happened as recent as 1975.
And I already explained to you. You're conflating two different things. One is leftover impacts from racist policies in the past. So yeah, we had a systemic racist system before the Civil Rights Act. Okay. I'll even grant you that there was apparently systemic redlining in 1977. Nobody's saying that there's no lasting impacts. Certainly, if your family, wasn't able to buy a home because of that, certainly your family wealth is going to be lower today. That is not the same as saying the system today is systemically racist. That is saying something different. That is saying that we have a history of systemic racism, and there are still some leftover impacts. But the point is that the systemic racism ended in the 1970s when redlining was abolished, and as a matter of law, it's no longer okay to redline based on race, aka the system is no longer racist.
So I think this is where we're running into an issue, and I get it. I just don't think you're able to follow the train of logic here, which is just, I don't know what else I can do to explain it. But sure, if they abolish the practice of redlining, but then some of the lasting impacts of redlining are still there, and then we have tangential systems which are based on property value, which was the greatest thing that redlining affected, then at that point, then any people that are subjected to that sentence, quote, all Americans, any people who would be subjected to that system would be subject to some form of oppression at that point. And so then that's where we have it, right? So obviously most people can't afford, like, obviously people who have been negatively impacted by some of these racist systems can't afford, obviously, to step outside of the education system to do homeschooling or to do what's it called, or to do private schools. So then they're going to probably have to be subjected to the public schools. So then if you're subjected to public schools, and then in the case that it's law that you have to go to them, and so you're subjected to public schools, and then while you're subjected to public schools, you know that these public schools are funded by the property value, but we know that the property value of these areas are negatively impacted because of the redlining that existed in something as recent as 1977. And so then at that point, then yes, that would be, even though, like, the system might not be intended to be racist, you would definitely be able to witness from that logically that it negatively impacts people of color. And so that's what the issue is. It's not necessarily that the system is designed to be racism, or that it's codified as racist. It's that it disproportionately impacts people of color, and so it would be systemic oppression at that point.
Okay, well, that is one factor out of many factors, and very, very attenuated, and is completely different than the original argument. So your basic argument,
No.
your argument for systemic racism in the United States has been reduced to there's some very attenuated, long-lasting, trailing impacts on property values in black
No.
neighborhoods, which is one of maybe 45 or 50 different factors, and there's this very attenuated, stretched out sort of maybe you could draw a connection to this, and that is somehow your entire argument for systemic racism. That's not
No, no, no,
very
no, no, no.
compelling.
No. I'm sorry. First off, this attenuance that you're talking about here, I don't think that it's really been. I don't think it's been exemplified. God knows how. Like I said, so many economists have already mentioned on a number of cases like that. Even though it's been codified illegal, that it still has its practices now. So like you can say however much attenuation you think is happening, but in reality, these communities are still dilapidated. Some of these communities still don't have property value there. Now, if you want to shift it to as you did earlier, this is what happened earlier. You mentioned no, it's not a matter of them like redlining necessarily anymore. Now they're not basing it anything on race whatsoever. They're basing it based off of poverty. But it's like, well, the redlining that you originally did is what created some of this poverty, this irrevocable poverty. And so then now at this point, you're saying, well, okay, fine, we won't base it based on race anymore, but based on poverty. Well, if the poverty is something that you created based on this system, then that means that poverty should be tied to the system, and then to disallow people to buy property or to upgrade neighborhoods based on that, then yeah, and you're still you're the system is still based on the previous system's systemic racism. So in this case, yeah, like I don't think we disagree here. It seems like you agree with me very much that yeah, the system was negatively impactful in that way, but then they codified it to be illegal, and then you expected that there would be some attenuance of some kind, but that clearly we can see in all data that most of these neighborhoods haven't recovered, except for in the case in which there is like gross gentrification, in which case the people of color are not negative, I mean, are not positively impacted by such gentrification, and they normally relocate because the place becomes unaffordable for those people. So in reality, yeah, it doesn't seem like there's been any attenuance. Are there any data points anywhere that point towards an attenuance in most of the really negatively impacted neighborhoods from redlining? I don't think so.
I just think it's a long line to draw, and especially when
Really conflicting.
so many other factors go into property values, and we've completely eliminated all of the laws that were barriers to African Americans getting more education, getting better jobs, doing all these different things. I don't think you can blame the low property values on any kind of legacy of redlining. Maybe it's 1% of the reason. Maybe it's 2% of the reason why
Do
property
you have
values are
any
low in
data
those
to
neighborhoods.
support that?
Most of what determines property values is a result of individual choices of the people that live there and have lived there. And even if everything what you're saying is true, is that property values are low in African American areas because of the legacy of redlining. That is a legacy of systemic racism. That is not showing that the current system is systemically racist. And to address your point of, well, the system is still based on taxes for property values, so therefore the system is still systemically racist. That's not the case, because again, there's been everything done to eliminate systemic racism from the system. There's been everything done to allow all people in the United States, regardless of race, to make themselves better, to better themselves. And now that we've had decades and decades of actual equality before the law, I don't think you can say the system itself is racist, because I think there's probably a lot of other impacts that go into property values. And no, I don't have studies on why, what percentage of the property values in black areas is determined by a legacy of racism versus how much is it based on the individual choices of the people that have lived there previously.
Sure. Okay, so look, we have a study by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which show that the vast majority of neighborhoods marked hazardous in red ink on maps drawn by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corp from 1935 to 1939 are today much more likely than other areas to comprise lower income minority residents. Like, I'm only quoting that because I'm trying to figure out. You mentioned that there was some sort of attenuance that had happened over the from 1977 till now, but I don't think that that's reflected in any data points anywhere. So were you just saying that because you believed because of the fact that they had made it illegal that there was an attenuance, or was it like because we can point to the same thing? Like in 1968, they had the Sentencing Reform Act, and you would expect like the intent, like the expressed intent for them doing that was specifically to try to minimize this disparity. But then we saw an increase by 700% for Black women afterwards in sentencing length, whereas we only saw a 33% increase in sentencing length for white people, and likewise for males, it was very disproportionate to their white counterparts. So then again, I get the idea that hey, we made a law to fix this thing, so now it's better. But again, I don't think there's literally any data whatsoever that shows anywhere that there's been any attenuance whatsoever.
Well, you don't have to have data. It's just common sense. When something ended in 1977 and it's literally now 45 years later and you're suggesting the entire system is racist because there was redlining 45 years ago, that's an incredibly weak argument, and it's attenuated because that's a long amount of time to impact a issue that is a very complicated issue. There's a lot of different things that determine the value of property. Your first instinct is to blame it all on race, blame it all on systemic racism.
You don't
there's
know that.
probably
You don't know
40
that.
there's
You can't
40
speak
or
for that.
there's 40 or 50 different factors that we could discuss about why a property is a certain value it is, and you're suggesting it's all because of stuff that happened in before 1977. That's a long line of causation that I don't think you can draw.
I don't. It's not me drawing it like that. I'm not on the NCRC. I didn't create these studies to figure out whether or not these numbers have changed dramatically. I mean, again, it's not just one specific factor. Obviously, we do know that the single greatest indicator of income is education, like countrywide and worldwide. Actually, like education has the single greatest. It's the single greatest impacting factor in determining the lifetime wealth of an individual. We know this. Like there's data that suggests this. You know it just like I know it. So then if we know that there's a system that's disproportionately negatively impacting people of color on education, then we would say, man, that's going to be pretty oppressive by definition. And if that system of education is based on something that happened and hasn't been attenuated, right? There hasn't been any crazy attenuants. So then at that point, then we would probably say that, yeah, most likely this thing has negatively impacted this thing. It's not a crazy leap, right? It's like, no, this thing affects is literally what determines the education, the quality of education, and this thing was racist. So then these people's quality of education is going to be definitely lower. Like that's not a crazy leap in logic and some long rabbit hole of journey of all of these loosely related factors. These are directly impacted factors here.
Okay. I just disagree that it's that, and I don't think it's like
Do you have any data to say otherwise?
I don't think it goes back to race, because white people that live in poor areas also have bad education opportunities.
Sure. The difference is, though, and this is where another problem happens. Yes, white people in poor areas, even though, again, we just cited the numbers where they said that they were still something like something they went down a list, and it was like Macon, Georgia, 64.99% minority, Birmingham, Alabama, 63.91%, and so on and so forth. So these lists, like, yeah, they happen to be they're not the minorities in these locations. But then even if that's the case, then those people are still they're still more likely when they apply for jobs to get callbacks on their resumes. Whereas just having a black sounding name, we've already seen the largest study to date of that kind determine that people who have black sounding names are less likely to get callbacks, even if they have equal resumes with equal experience. So it's like, yeah. So even still, when you say, "Oh, well, what about the white people who are, unfortunate in those situations?" That's not systemically oppressive. Furthermore, we also recognize that those whites in those situations are less likely to be policed. They're less likely to be charged. Even if they are charged, they're less likely to get lengthy sentences. Like in every way, shape, or form, there's still an advantage. Which is crazy because you got people like me that decided, no, I'm just gonna rise above it, and I do. So I'm not gonna be a statistic. I'm
Well,
gonna
lots
always
of
rise
people.
above that. But that doesn't mean that just because I did it mean that I didn't have to work harder? I was born with a freaking gift. So it's like, man, now my gift is making a way for me. I can do something that less than 1% of the population can do musically. It's like, okay, well, okay, I have an advantage here. If I didn't have that gift, I don't know what the freak I would be doing. I'd probably be relegated to some of these low-end service sector jobs like the rest of people. Right?
Look,
The rest of the others.
I just don't think it's a productive way to look at the world when we've done already so much to end systemic racism. And I think that's your argument and causation is attenuated for two reasons. Number one, because something that ended in 1977 is not the primary reason why a property value is the way it is today. That's an incredibly long time, and it's only one factor out of many. But more importantly, even if that was all true, that is a very attenuated justification for saying the entire education system is racist, because you're talking about this very minor factor in a very complicated issue that is, even if it does sort of have these lingering effects, simply lingering effects on the system does not mean that the system itself is intentionally racist today. It means that there's maybe some lingering effects of a systemic racist issue a long time ago. And I don't think that I don't think it's productive to bring up all of the facts and data that you just did that are up for dispute, because they don't take into account a lot of the other factors. And so you can point out your facts about blacks are this percentage of a population, but they make this percentage of a thing. But from what I've read and from what I've studied, most of those data points do not take into account two different things: crime rates and civilian behavior. Two things that have a big impact on all of this data.
That's not fair, because look, so the thing you mentioned about crime rates and civilian behavior, right? Well, the crime rates are going to be directly impacted by the thing that we're discussing right now, right? So if we're saying that blacks are policed at a significantly disproportionate rate to whites, and then you say, hey, blacks tend to commit more crime, I feel like it almost begs the question, right? Like if you and I committed an equal amount of, I don't know, an equal amount of crime, or we violated something at equal rates, but I was subjected to more tests and searches and examinations than you were, then it would appear as if I committed more often than you do, right?
Okay, so hold on. Can I just say something?
Sure.
I get what you're trying to say, and it's just what you're coming from is basically this left-wing position that totally rejects any amount of personal responsibility. So I'll sit here. Hold on. Let me explain how it does. Because you cite your statistics that you think shows systemic racism. I then say that doesn't take into account civilian behavior or crime rates, so that the data doesn't actually prove systemic racism. And then you do this circular thing and you circle back around and then say, well, the reason the crime rates are different is because of the circular reasoning of there's systemic racism, and that's what causes the crime rates. And then the crime rates is all this stuff. And you're not allowing any space for personal responsibility and individual choices. My main position on this, just so you know, so I can actually state my position here, is that people's outcomes in life, particularly in the United States, are not controlled by either systemic racism or the opposite of systemic racism, call it white privilege, whatever you want. That's not the determining factor of how people's lives turn out. The determining factor in what happens with people's lives is individual choices by themselves and by their parents. And I think this whole notion of doing this, every stat and every argument you have a response to that's based on accusing society writ large and the America writ large of causing all these different problems rejects any notion of personal responsibility, and it's just this circular reasoning.
No. I got to stop you there because that's just completely dishonest. See, the thing is, I'm perfectly willing to admit that criminals should be punished. And that's the issue here, right? It's like, yes, if you're criminal, then you have a responsibility for some of those things, right? Like if you're a criminal and you're indicted, then yeah, you have a responsibility. But the problem that I'm pointing out here is that there's not an equal policing. So then it appears that we're more responsible for crime than we are. Here's a perfect example of that. Recent data indicates that African Americans make up 15% of the country's drug users, yet they comprise 37% of those arrested for drug violations, 59% of those convicted, and 74% of those sentenced to prison for a drug offense.
Okay.
So then it's like, wait a minute, hold on. So now this isn't a matter of me deflecting personal responsibility for those people that were convicted and for the people that fit those statistics. They did something wrong. The issue that I'm pointing out to you is that 85 of the people who are doing that thing wrong are not being punished for it.
Okay. Now let me respond to that.
That's bad math. That's not how that works.
No, I get what you're saying. And again, I think you're rejecting a notion of personal responsibility this time on the perpetrators of doing it. And so let's assume. Hold on, let me finish. Let me explain what I mean by that.
That's
because you're basically, let's just all assume for the sake of argument that the only reason crime rates are higher for a certain race is because of their over policing. That is most likely explained by a couple of bad apples in the police force, that there's a racist cop here, there's a racist cop there. And so you're blaming society and the system for individual cops that, let's say, are racist. And I've never denied that there's a racist cop out there, there's good cops, there's bad cops. But again, you're citing stuff that can be explained by other factors and does not show systemic racism. So let's say that you've got a racist cop. That racist cop over polices black people. That doesn't mean the system itself is racist. That means you've got a racist cop. We got to define what the difference is here. One is a system, one is a person.
Again, you keep trying to do this shift here where you like refocus to like an individual, right? And that's not the problem here. It's not a matter of just whether there's an individual racist cop. That's like, again, that's so banal because we've already admitted that that's a thing. We know that there are racist individuals. The point that I'm picking out is when you say that blacks make up 15% of the country's drug users, but 74% of those sentenced for drug offenses, 15 versus 74, that's not the work of one individual bad cop. When we're talking about 15, I didn't say of the states, I didn't say of the cities, I didn't say of the counties, I said of the countries. So when you start talking about something as wild, you got 350 million people in this country, and you're saying, like of all of and God, we already obviously know that we're in the middle of this insane like drug use, drug issue, right? So they're trying to draft legislation to try to curtail it because you have all these opioid addicts. We have the opioid crisis. We obviously have had one of the largest war on drugs since like God knows how long. So yeah, there's drug use is pretty. It's a significant issue here. And so when you say 15% of the country's entire drug users are black, yet we make up 74%. Yeah, you can't hand wave that and then try to whittle it down to, well, it's just a bad copy.
Okay, yeah. What's your source? No. I've never heard that. What's the source for that claim? I've never heard that one.
Sure, let me find it. Let's look that up. 15% drug use, 74% conviction. Let me just I'm gonna just put the whole quote in Google.
So I found a statistic that says blacks are not over arrested and are actually underrepresented in prison. McDonald writes in The War on Cops, the statistics on the race of criminals as reported by the crime victims match the arrest data. As long ago as 1978, a study of robbery and aggravated assault in 8 cities found parity between the race of assailants and victims reports and in arrests, a finding replicated many times among a range of crimes. Criminologist Alfred Blumstein determined in 1993 that blacks were significantly underrepresented in prison for homicide compared with their presence in the arrest data. So,
can you quote me that study? Can you link me that one? I want to read it. Find out. what you're talking about.
Sure. It's a Daily Wire. It's a Daily Wire article said seven statistics that show systemic racism doesn't exist in policing. It's from 2016, but that's not even. I mean, that's just something that somebody sent to me. I actually like the. Let me see if I can send it to you on Discord. I actually like this. This latest Wall Street Journal piece that actually cites Harvard economist studies showing that this isn't a thing, and I can send you that Wall Street Journal article too. But look, I mean, I've never heard the study that African Americans are 15% of drug users, but 75% of drug arrests. That seems to fly in the face of almost all of the other studies. You know, especially when it comes to other police activities like shooting unarmed people. But I've never heard that about the 15% of drug users, but 75% of.
I don't know where they cite the actual source.
And
here's the article. I'm gonna link it to you on Discord.
If this is mainstream media, I'm gonna flip out. Just kidding. ACLU.org.
That's the article. I'm trying to figure out what the name of the specific report was. Dang it. I had all of it literally at one point, like literally with all of the citations, and my hard drive failed on me, which kind of sucks. But
okay, so this is from 2006. This is talking about an act passed in 1986.
Yeah, the anti-drug
and the difference between powder cocaine and crack cocaine.
Yeah, the 100 to 1 disparity. We don't even have that disparity anymore. It's been reduced. It's just
okay.
It's not 1 to 1.
Well, I just wonder. I wonder if these statistics could be explained by again what the Wall Street Journal talks about: differences in civilian behavior and crime rates. So, for example, 15% of the country's drug users, but 75% of sentenced to prison for drug offense. One of the ways that you most likely are going to get sentenced to prison for drug offense is if there's other crimes either in your past or in the same act that was resulted in the drug arrest, for example. So without more data, without seeing this study, there's no way to tell if this actually takes into account those two things.
Here goes one from the Hamilton Project, which I think does a good job of demonstrating it. This isn't the exact same study, but yeah, here we go. The Hamilton Project. So on that chart, blacks are 6.5 times as likely as whites to be incarcerated for drug-related crimes.
Again, but does that take into account the differences between other crime rates and civilian behavior?
I would imagine that. I just feel like it's almost silly to sit there and think like, well, yeah, but they're intentionally like this is what their job is, and we're just gonna assume like, yeah, they're leaving out these other really, really strong and obvious confounding factors that are most likely to
That's what the experts say. That's what the experts say. The experts.
Show me that. Show me a link. Give me a link to someone saying that.
Sure. I mean, I've got it. I've got it right here. In fact, I'll send it to you right now. It's Wall Street Journal. It's probably behind a paywall, which is why I've got a PDF of it.
Okay, good.
But this is a published author citing multiple different studies and flat out stating that most of the contrary evidence, which is again one of the things that I take issue with this whole thing, is that this is used for partisan political purposes. It doesn't help us get to good policies. It's not a productive or healthy. It's not a productive, healthy way to go about it. And so that answers the question about why would there be so much evidence out there that is misleading and doesn't take into account all of these other factors, is because this is a partisan political project to basically get Democrats elected, and it's not supported by the data. And to the extent that these disparities exist, they're often explained by differences in individual choices. And I would give you extent maybe a tiny bit of that difference in disparity between the statistics can be explained by a racist cop, but I don't think having a racist cop or even 10 racist cops makes the system itself racist. That makes, there's bad cops out there. Look, I'm with, if your only point is that, hey, look, there are some cops that are racist and they do terrible stuff. I would love to try to figure out ways to actually resolve that point. But you're attacking. But you're attacking. Like, why keep, my point is that if I know that it's not.
But that's not my point.
I know that it's not your point.
It's really bad, really banal, really like completely.
I literally just said no. I literally just said I know that's not. I never said that it was your point. I said if that was your point, then we could agree on that's terrible, and let's talk about ways to fix it. But that's not your point. Your point is that you're saying the entire system itself is racist, which is then turned into a partisan political point, and that's where you're dividing the country. You're making a divisive claim that goes to the very root of what America is founded upon, and it's inconsistent, I think, with what Martin Luther King Jr. talked. It's not based on the facts. It gets rid of personal responsibility. It's not a healthy or productive way to go. It doesn't result in any kind of good policies. It's just simply a divisive and antagonistic thing.
No, it's not antagonistic. What's antagonistic is looking at the face of data and then saying, well, no, it's kind of my opinion that, like, well, really what's really happening is just more along the lines
I'm not saying it's my opinion. I just literally cited a Wall Street Journal article.
And then I can't read that Wall Street Journal article. It's just an op-ed. It's not a study. Like, yeah. So then, and then obviously, like, yeah. So it's really egregious to me, right? Like it's an egregious example of like dishonesty to sit and look in the face of data that shows this is the system and this is what the ramifications of it are, and then to say, well, once that system was made illegal, it's perfectly fine then, right? And it's like, no, like that's not how things work. It's not like everyone had like, and again, especially something as recent as 1977, when you want to start talking about generational wealth, right? It's like, okay, so my parents own real estate. I won't be that victim. Again, my parents were raised upper middle class, but I know that not to be the case for most people in that same era for most people of color. They they were outliers when it came to those statistics. But then I'm not going to use that as an example and then say, oh my God, I made it. Why can't everyone else? When I recognize the systems and the differences and difficulties that they had to overcome in order to do it. Mom had to get
now you're being the one dishonest with my positions and my statements, because that's not what I'm saying. That's not what my position has been. Every single one of my opinions and beliefs with respect to the facts and the data has been backed up by research by Harvard economist Ronald Fryer, a 2015 Justice Department analysis, and August 2016 proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
Cite it. So what exactly are you citing that says that he backed you? What was it again?
Yeah, Harvard economist Roland G. Fryer. He's a well-known Harvard economist that's done lots of studies.
What did he say?
He said there is no evidence of racial discrimination in police shootings.
Can you link me to like what's he basing it on? Like what's the article? Because I can't read that article. The thing that you linked me,
I can Google Harvard. I can Google his name if you want for you and send you the first link that comes up.
Put the PDF in the Discord. Unless it's more than like 8 megabytes, which that'd be really strange for a PDF to be that large.
No, I'll send it to you. The point is that you mischaracterizing my position and saying, oh, I just disagree with all of these facts and data that you have because that's my personal feelings. That's complete bullshit. I've got study after study after study after data after data afof that there is no systemic racism. Not only that, but all of the facts and data that I have, which I've literally cited to you the exact journal, the authors and the year, which is all you need for a citation. More importantly than that, what I have backing my belief is actual law that specifically outlaws and makes illegal any kind of racial discrimination. And so for you to sit here and accuse an entire system of being... Stop interrupting me. For you to sit here and accuse an entire system of being racist when it's literally illegal within that system to be racist, and then for you to base that on stuff that happened decades and decades and decades ago, and then to use lingering effects of previous systemic racism, which nobody disputes, to then try to call a system that prides itself on equality and has done a better job than anywhere else to do it, I think is not helpful. All right,
All
I'm
right, so
uploading it right now.
here, look, I think these were the one. I don't think that I'm accusing every aspect of every system of being systemically oppressive. That's not what I'm doing at all. What I am saying though is that obviously when we look at the data, like that, it shows like it's kind of borne out things disproportionately negative for people of color. Now, just because something disproportionately negatively impacts people of color does not mean that it's codified to disproportionately negatively impact people of color. And again, me making that statement that it disproportionately negatively impacts people of color is not me saying that this system, everything in it's codified racism. That's not so.
So then what's causing
Yeah,
it?
you can. It's like
What are
maybe
you saying is causing it then? Or what's the problem with it? What's causing it?
so what hold on. So what I've done is that yes, so the systems that were in place that maybe were that at one point were codified to be codified racist, now that that it's gone, that the lasting impacts and the lasting effects of those systems are negatively impacting African Americans, and then with systems that are based on based on economics that were net largely impacted by these codified racist systems, then at that point now you have a problem because there if the systems are designed based off of economics by racistly codified programs, then at that point, then yeah, you would have systemic oppression. We would be systemically oppressed because we would not have access to the same wealth and the same economic factors that would allow us to contribute to compete.
Well, if that's what you're
Did you link that PDF?
Yeah, I did. But okay,
Oh,
so
sweet.
but my point is that that's not the only thing that determines all of these different outcomes that you're talking about. And so you're taking lingering effects of things that happened decades and decades and decades ago to argue that the current system itself is racist. I don't think that supports your argument. There's many other factors that go into the issue of all of these different outcomes, whether it's property values or crime rates, a lot of individual choices of the people involved. And that's why I say your position basically does away with personal responsibility and blames everything on society. And so nobody who's taking part in this, whether it's the bad perpetrators or the victims of it, none of them have any responsibility, and it's all just because of the racist system. When it's like, first of all, the system itself isn't racist today. There's maybe lingering effects of prior systemic racism, which doesn't mean that the current system is racist. And more importantly, even if that is impacting the current system today, that's one factor of many, 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 many factors. And I don't think it's productive or helpful to attack the entire system as racist when there's a lot of other factors that can explain a lot of these different outcomes.
Okay, so what would you say is the reason? What would you say is the reason for blacks having lower quality access to lower access to quality education? Why would you say that
I
is?
would say it's the same reason why some white people have lower quality, lower access to quality education. It's because of where they live. It's because of who their parents are. It's whether or not they live in a family. It's whether or not they have a religious beliefs. It's whether or not their extended family plays a role. There's a lot of different factors, and I think it's the easy way out. It's the easy way out to just say, oh, it's all systemic racism.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. So you're saying that a black family, that's a whole family living in a bad neighborhood, they'll have a higher quality education?
I think that if you had a neighborhood where there's a bunch of intact families, that yes, that would increase the property values and increase the quality of education there. Obviously,
Okay.
one
So
one individual
So
person.
that's not what I asked. That's not what I asked. I'm sorry. Let me ask it one more time. Are you saying that if it was a whole family, living in a bad neighborhood, that their quality of education would be better?
100% yes, because you know what?
How?
Your education that you get out of a public school is largely based on what you put into it and how much your parents are involved with it. And one kid that goes to the same school can have a completely different education experience than another kid that goes to that school based on the parenting at home. That's a huge
That's
difference.
that's dishonest. Could we would it be fairer to say, would we not be able to look at funding for the education and say that that has a bigger quantifiable effect on the
No.
education of an individual? No.
I
So
do
you're
not
saying,
think funding has
no,
the
no, no, no,
biggest
no, no, no,
impact
no,
on
no, no, no.
education.
Okay,
No,
great.
absolutely not.
Okay, hold on.
Throwing
Educate.
money at these garbage school
That's
districts doesn't do
crazy.
jack crap for making the schools better. Throwing money at crappy school districts is the last thing you want to do to try to increase quality of school. What I actually believe in is school choice and getting rid of teachers unions. And those two things right there would do a hell of a lot more to increase the quality of education in this country than throwing money at the teachers unions.
Let's see. Okay, so I'm looking up a statistic that talks about the impact of funding on public education.
Oh, I'm sure you've got all kinds of statistics and studies that support that.
I
I
haven't.
doubt that
I
you
don't
on
have
that.
any because I didn't. I did. I really. I literally never thought in a million years that there would be someone that would make the argument that literally lack of funding would impact an education. Like that sounds so insane to me. I never looked anything up like this in my life, but I'll find it. That's crazy.
Well, it really doesn't. It really doesn't go to. I mean, now we're arguing about whether we should do school choice and get rid of teachers
No, I'm
unions
not arguing about
versus.
that. I'm only arguing about whether or not funding would impact an education because obviously we know that the educational
It's
funding
one. Fine,
is
I'll
tied
give
to
it to you.
property
It's one
values.
factor. Fine, I'll give it to you. It's one factor.
Okay. Because that sounded insane to me. Okay, good. So okay, good. That was the first factor you mentioned. You mentioned whether or not that they were an intact family. Then you also mentioned what was the next one? Good. So we're past that one. So the second factor you mentioned was let me see. You said whether or not I don't know. Can you go through that list again? You
What's
said
the factors of what impacts the quality of
the
education?
yeah. What impact the quality of education? Like because you obviously said it wasn't just like the redlining. You said there were a bunch of other factors. What were they? I'm gonna write them down really quick.
Well, frankly, I think a lot of the factors that have very little to do with the race of anybody involved, and it has to do with governance decisions at the state and the federal level, frankly.
No.
And
That's not what you. That's not what
and it
you
has to do
said.
with the individuals that are partaking in the entire
What
system. In
about the
fact,
individuals?
I dated and lived with a teacher who was teaching for AmeriCorps in Miami in low income areas, and I know for a fact that the quality of that education had mostly to do with the parenting that was going at home, or rather lack thereof, and how that impacted children's ability to succeed in school. And so I think the parents at home and how the parents are parenting have a much larger impact on whether a kid is getting a good education and than funding for the school district, because funding for school districts is certainly it's different across different school districts, but it's not massively substantial. Most states have state constitutions that require every school district to be adequately funded, and so I just don't think again you're taking a very complicated issue that has many different factors impacting it and just blaming it all on race when it's not the biggest
No, I'm
impact.
not. I'm not. No, I absolutely no. That's not true whatsoever. Okay, again, that's a misrepresentation. Absolutely believe parental impactful when it comes to education. I also believe absolutely that you can get more out of education if you desire it more. Like I totally agree with that. However, funding for education is like has a demonstrable and quantifiable impact that is much larger than those other. I think if we were going to look at large scale data, that the largest impact on education in individual and great disparities between different counties. Obviously, I get that money just can't fix education. We spend more money on education in this country than
Right.
any other country in the world, and we have really low like our education actually. Um, I'm not saying that the money is the end all be all. However, what I am saying is that underfunded public education absolutely has an impact on the graduation rates, has an impact on yeah the success of the students. Like
Oh, okay.
That's
Yeah, all
just
right.
that's
Even if
how.
even if it does, and I'll grant it to you that funding can have an impact on graduation and success of the students. We are now 3 or 4 steps removed from an actual systemically racist system. So
No,
this
you're
all yes, it is. Let me
not.
let me
No, 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 no.
explain. So hold on. Let
No,
me
let,
finish my
okay,
point.
go ahead.
You're going from redlining that occurred in the 60s and 70s to then one step is that reduces the value of real property. That's a big jump, a big step, very attenuated, multiple factors. And then you're going from that step, you're making another jump to then the value of the real property then has this impact on school districts and their funding. Another minor factor, because again every state guarantees funding for schools, and then you're taking that factor and making another jump and saying that then controls the outcome of all these people, and each single one of these steps are very complicated systems that have a ton of different factors that go into it. So we're 3 or 4 steps removed, and every single one of those steps is a very complex system that has very complex impacts, and you're reducing all of it when these are very complicated things that involve all kinds of different things. You're reducing all of it to systemic racism when there's so many different steps and so many different factors. I don't think it supports the point, even if everything you're saying is factually true. I don't think it supports the argument that that our society is systemically racist.
Okay, so I feel like you tried your best to express that as possible, such to make it sound like it was some really magnanimous leap from one point to the next. And it's really, really freaking simple. Education is funded by property values in their area. Redlining meant that you couldn't increase the property values of an area. It's really simple. It's not very indirect. This isn't some reach around the world in order to get to some point. Like, no, 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 no. It's really, 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 really simple. And it's not direct, but it's literally not direct by one single factor. Education, I mean, redlining stopped them from developing freaking property, and then property directly impacts the funding of an education. And obviously, the funding of an education, as you already admitted, definitely impacts the success of the average student there. So no, this isn't some crazy leap. This is really, really simple, really, really direct, and you already agreed to that. Come on.
I didn't agree to it.
You did. You said okay, so now you're. So let's walk back to that. So do I need to go ahead and resume my research? My search for a study that proves that obviously underfunding in education has a negative impact on the success of the average student that attends.
No, I
Do I
was
need to
I
finish that? Because
no
I thought
I
I didn't need.
for the sake of argument, I gave it to you that it's one thing that impacts it. I don't think it's the controlling
Okay.
impact, again, because almost every state guarantees adequate funding for schools regardless of the district, and I think there's a lot of other important issues, and so that's just like the property values in a local district don't control entirely the funding for that education system. And that funding for that education system does not control entirely the outcome of the students. And that's why I say it's all these different leaps and not taking into account the real factors. Like, how do you address the issue that every single state guarantees, most of them in their state constitutions, adequate proper funding for school districts so that even if a school district has extremely low property values, they still get from the state funding sufficient to meet the standards?
No, 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 no. No, 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 no. Because we obviously know that's not to be the case. Because we obviously recognize that in minority communities that that minority communities, specifically those impacted by redlining, that they have fewer teachers, more students per classroom. They have less extracurriculars, access to all of this. And we quit funding, we obviously recognize that some of those things like extracurricular activities, fewer students per classroom, teachers having more funding for specific forms of classes like electronics and better electives, obviously have a greater impact on children's willingness to contribute to their education, participate meaningfully in their education. So like yeah, like just because the state has what we're going to do what's quote unquote adequate, we obviously recognize when we see the graduation and the grades and obviously access to quality in some of these places is significantly lower. And especially when we recognize that some of this impact and some of this funding, the majority of this funding comes from property values, then then obviously it's going to have a it's going to have an effect. And again, you keep mentioning this attenuance that happened. Like, and there's literally zero data that suggested. I brought up a study that spoke against that. So no, like there hasn't been some crazy attenuance that's happened since the 1977s when this thing went. It just hasn't. And here's a problem. I want you to recognize something. When you're talking about 1977, oh, that's what, 42 years ago, right? 43,
Yeah.
43 years ago. I mean, we're still in 2020. So if you're talking about that, you have people like me, like the average adult now, the average adult would still have exposed to the education that was impacted, right? And again, we have plenty of studies that show, despite the fact that they codified it as illegal, nothing has been done to rectify the damage that was. So, like, sure, you can go and say, "Hey, you guys, it's illegal." But if you don't do anything to rectify all of the issues and some of the degradation of these that happened as a result of this practice that has now been made illegal, it doesn't fix anything. Like you can say, hey, it's illegal for me to be an arsonist and burn your after I've already lit your house on fire and you've lost all of your value in your. That doesn't fix it. It's like, okay, hey, it's illegal now. All right, great, I'll never do it. You don't got your house, bro. Something needs to be, and if you don't, then that means that everybody who is exposed to the education that's a direct result is now at a disadvantage. Right?
Yeah, you're breaking up on me a little bit. Are you having internet issues?
I don't believe I am. It sounds I'm streaming and I'm not like getting any to
Huh.
my knowledge.
You're cutting out hardcore. I'm hearing only like every other word.
Yeah, I'm streaming perfectly. You're cutting out as well though.
Well, we've been talking for
Here,
an
I'm
hour and
playing.
a half. Do you want to keep going?
I mean, I guess if you're kind of done with the conversation, I guess we can. Yeah, there's another topic I wanted to bring up to you as well, though, which was the protests and like their impact on obviously the greater, broader conversation. Like, I mean,